Also on Sunday, some protesters defaced the statue of late British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in London, calling him a racist. Meanwhile, people in the British city of Bristol toppled the statue of a 17th century slave trader. Rallies were also staged in other European countries. In Brussels, thousands of people gathered outside the city's Palace of Justice. Skirmishes broke out between police and demonstrators. Rallies were also held in Rome and Madrid. Tony Gosling is an investigative journalist and he joins us out of Bristol. Tony, welcome. What do you make, before we get to the incident that occurred in your hometown, what do you make of the second day of violence? We've seen violence in central London, just near Downing Street.
Let me say, I think there's also a big contingent of people who are fed up with the lockdown, who are using this as an excuse to get out and about and to mingle with others where they haven't really been able to in other circumstances. Also, 99% of those coming out are not violent protesters, and what often happens is these sorts of protests, anti-racist protests, are hijacked by a few hot-heads who use them for their own political purposes. This is one of the things we have to be very careful of when we gather peacefully, is that we don't allow our demonstrations to be hijacked by a violent element.
Now, in Bristol, we saw the protesters bring down the statue of Edward Colston.
Yeah.
It was very reminiscent of the bringing down of the statue of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. You can draw comparisons there, yet and the joy of the people after the statue was taken down, yet we've seen the Home Secretary Priti Patel condemning in very harsh terms the protesters who had done that, describing it as utterly disgraceful. Was that called for?
Look, it's utterly disgraceful that this statue has been sitting there for such a long time in the middle of Bristol city centre. The guy's a slave trader. I mean, I've spent much of my time as a journalist criticising the merchant venturers, who are an ancient organisation in the city here, who Edward Colston was a member of, and they made massive amounts of money out of the slave trade, and their money is still around today. They're a very secretive organisation. We call them the Bristol Mafia, and that's how they're colloquially known around here. They like to think they own the city. They never really appear in public, but they're a very secretive bunch. But it's really good to see this being used, I think it's probably fair to say, as an excuse to get rid of this guy, because even though we've got a mixed race mayor now, a Labour mayor for the first time, he's done nothing really to talk about the slave trading past of Bristol. Along with Liverpool, we are the two biggest slave trading ports in Britain. And even though we've got a mixed race mayor, he's done very little about this. So it's great to see the people on the ground are doing it for him.
And Piers Morgan, who I'm not his biggest fan, he's saying, does Priti Patel even know who Edward Colston was? Major slave trader involved in the transportation of 84,000 enslaved African-American men and women, 19,000 of which died on voyages from West Africa and the Caribbean.
Well, actually, it's worse than that, because the society he is part of, the Merchant Venturers, they, just before they formed under a royal charter, which means we can't as journalists scrutinise them at all, only the Privy Council, the Queen, can look into their accounts, that they actually financed John Cabot's trip to the United States, which went to Newfoundland and was the first contact with North America, and look where that led. So we're talking about the same people that exploited, and that led to mass genocide of Native Americans, not just talking here about the slaves that died on the way and the whole slave trade itself. Now, these people today own vast amounts of shares in our privatised utilities, so they're still making money. Every time you turn on the tap, the merchant venturers still get a few pennies, and I think it's about time this figure in the city was brought down. The actual campaign doing it, though, Black Lives Matter, is a fantastic racist campaign, but it's not really a grassroots campaign. It's a funded campaign, and that bothers me a bit, because it means the funders choose the leaders of the campaign, and we've seen these sorts of things in many countries which have come out on the streets, for example in Ukraine, to create a lot of tension. So we need to keep a close eye. And also, of course, we don't have the same sort of problem here in Britain as the United States does. And I was quite surprised to see these demonstrations taking place in Britain and other parts of Europe. Almost as if they were kind of copycatting what had happened in the United States. Even in 2016, Black Lives Matter here in Bristol were chanting, "Hands up, don't shoot." And it sounded to me as if they were kind of reading from a US script. And also the other thing is that a genuine grassroots anti-racism campaign would inevitably lead to criticism of Israel, with an anti-apartheid campaign against Israel, and Black Lives Matter doesn't really seem to have gone there, which is a pity. Also, we have problems not so much now with racism here in Bristol. We've got a very good multicultural city. We've got problems with poverty of all shapes and sizes and colours. So it doesn't necessarily help turning it into a race issue. I think the real problem we're suffering now, with many people completely penniless and destitute, particularly after the lockdown, is poverty, not racism.
Okay. And Priti Patel, who, let's not forget, was removed under Theresa May, her government, for holding secret talks with Israeli officials in the occupied Golan Heights on how to set up field hospitals for terrorists in Syria. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, thank you very much indeed for your contribution.